On screen, he was perfection. Offstage, he was fractured. Norman Bates wasn't a character he played. It became the cage he lived in. One role rewrote his entire world, and what nobody knew was the cost of that immortality. The story you'll discover isn't just about the shower scene or the box office triumph. It's about a beautiful, intelligent man who became trapped between two identities, chasing a life that felt increasingly impossible. Stay to the end. The real horror was always hidden behind the public persona. April 1932 arrived in Manhattan, and with it came Anthony Perkins, born into a theatrical legacy that promised everything and delivered nothing but pressure. His father, Osgood Perkins, was a celebrated actor of stage and screen, the kind of leading man who commanded rooms, who graced films and curtain calls with the authority of a man who'd earned his place. But success, in those years, demanded constant presence. Work kept Osgood away from home for months at a time. When he was there, the house tensed with his intensity. Young Anthony, desperate for attention, found himself overshadowed by the very father he admired. At 5 years old, that tension ended abruptly. Osgood Perkins died, taking with him any chance of reconciliation, any final words that might have softened the confusion and rejection the boy carried. A therapist would later tell Anthony that this wound shaped everything: the hunger for approval, the fear of abandonment, the precision with which he'd build his masks. His mother, Janet Rain, was a homemaker of quieter temperament, but she too was absorbed in the theatrical world's orbit. The young Anthony became a sensitive, introverted child, shy in crowds, brilliant in observation. He learned to watch people carefully, to understand what lay beneath surfaces. By adolescence, he'd taught himself the art of transformation, not through method acting or theory, but through survival. He needed to belong somewhere. He needed to be liked. The stage, he discovered, could give him both. At 15, he joined Actors Equity and began performing in summer stock productions, playing small roles with intensity that surprised directors. Here was a skinny, beautiful boy who understood vulnerability in a way most actors twice his age did not. Columbia University and Rollins College followed, but neither could contain him. Acting was the only thing that made sense. He hitchhiked to Hollywood at 18 with audacious confidence, the kind only teenagers possess. He'd read that MGM was adapting a play called Years Ago, one he'd performed in at a small theater in Delaware. Surely, he reasoned, he'd have an advantage over the hundreds of contract players already under the studio's control. The logic was absurd, he later admitted, but he believed it anyway. MGM didn't give him a screen test. They gave him something better, a chance to be the foil for an actress in her screen test. The camera lingered on her face. His head appeared, mostly from the back. But 6 months later, a letter arrived. Report for costume test. Within 2 years, he debuted in The Actress alongside Gene Simmons and Spencer Tracy. And by 1954, his Broadway performance in Tea and Sympathy earned him national recognition. He was the beautiful, ethereal leading man Hollywood had been waiting for, vulnerable but masculine, strange but compelling. Paramount Pictures signed him to a 7-year contract and promoted him as the studio's last great matinee idol. Then came Friendly Persuasion. In 1956, Perkins played a young Quaker, torn between his pacifist faith and the call to war. The role revealed something nobody expected: depth without artifice, sensitivity without softness, conviction without vanity. He earned an Academy Award nomination at just 24 years old. Studios began pairing him with major actresses: Audrey Hepburn, Sophia Loren, Jane Fonda. The public narrative was crystallizing. Anthony Perkins was the romantic male lead of the new Hollywood generation. He would be a star. But something beneath the surface was fracturing. Throughout the 1950s, Hollywood operated on a precise code. To be a leading man meant to appear heterosexual, to date starlets publicly, to be seen as a desirable lover of women. Perkins understood the code perfectly. He dated. He was photographed, but the relationships were hollow. He found himself drawn to men, to their company, their intelligence, their bodies. Dancer Grover Dale entered his life in the mid-1950s, and for years, they shared something real. But it had to remain hidden, disguised as friendship, acknowledged only behind closed doors. Tab Hunter, another beautiful young actor, became a confidant. Perkins confessed his feelings, his confusion, his fear. The entertainment industry had no place for men like them. One public admission would destroy everything he'd built. The cost of visibility was silence. Yet the public persona kept growing. Newsweek featured him on the cover in 1958, hailing him as the heir apparent to Clark Gable and Gary Cooper. He'd recorded 3 pop music albums. Moonlight Swim peaked at number 24 on the Billboard Hot 100. He appeared in films with legends, directed by masters. And then, Alfred Hitchcock called. Hitchcock had been searching for someone to play Norman Bates in a screenplay adaptation of Robert Bloch's novel. The character was supposed to be in his 40s, a drunk, a voyeur. Everything Norman was supposed to be made him unmarketable. Hitchcock approached screenwriter Joseph Stefano and said simply, "How would you feel if Norman Bates were played by Anthony Perkins?" Stefano's resistance collapsed immediately. Perkins, despite his beauty and star status, carried something unsettling, an undertone of menace masked by boyish charm, a darkness flickering beneath the surface. On screen, he could be vulnerable and frightening simultaneously. He was perfect. Psycho film between 1959 and early 1960. Perkins spent weeks on set in Hollywood, while Hitchcock methodically crafted the shower scene. The director needed Perkins to understand Norman on a molecular level, not just the psychology of a killer, but the fractured contradictions beneath his skin. How does a man become monstrous? What loneliness drives him to that extreme? Perkins drew on something deep inside himself, something he'd never articulated, but had always known. The way desire and shame could intertwine into self-destruction. He was not playing Norman Bates. He was channeling a version of himself he kept hidden, then projecting it onto the screen with terrifying precision. The film premiered on September 8, 1960, and changed everything. The shower scene became legendary. Janet Leigh's screaming, the stabbing, the reveal. Within weeks, Psycho was the most discussed film in America. And Anthony Perkins was Norman Bates. By 1961, he'd tried to escape it. He appeared in Goodbye Again, a romantic drama opposite Ingrid Bergman, and won Best Actor at Cannes. He moved to Europe, taking roles in Orson Welles' The Trial, in French productions, in anything that might distance him from the motel keeper. But America could not forget. He was Norman. No matter what role he took, audiences saw only the shadow of that character, the madness, the wrongness. Studios in the United States wouldn't cast him in romantic leads anymore. Directors feared audiences would see the killer behind the smile. By 1963, he'd been effectively written out of American cinema's romantic narratives. Only European directors would give him complex roles. So he stayed abroad for years, building a parallel career, refusing to return to a country that had defined him by a single performance. What nobody knew, and what Perkins himself rarely acknowledged, was that he spent these years in internal torment. He was a gay man in an industry that would destroy him if the truth emerged. He was a brilliant actor reduced to one role. He was physically beautiful, but increasingly aware that beauty was a prison, not a gift. And he was deeply unhappy. In therapy, he explored everything. He read theory. He analyzed his own motivations with the precision of a surgeon. His therapist, psychologist Mildred Newman, became his guide through a landscape of shame, desire, and the desperate need to be accepted. By the late 1960s, a plan emerged. Perhaps he could change. Perhaps with enough therapy, enough determination, he could rewire himself to live a conventional life. Perhaps he could want women the way the world demanded. In 1971, he ended his 7-year relationship with Grover Dale. The breakup devastated him. He reached out to friends for support, and they recommended he intensify his therapy. He committed to trying conversion therapy, a practice mainstream psychologists now recognize as harmful pseudoscience, but which was then presented as a legitimate path to heterosexuality. He also attempted to have heterosexual encounters, according to his friend Tab Hunter's memoir. During the filming of The Life and Times of Judge Roy Bean in 1972, Perkins had his first sexual experience with a woman, co-star Victoria Principal. Hunter reported that Perkins was simultaneously ending his long relationship with Dale and undergoing intensive therapy to become heterosexual. The effort was performed with the same intensity he brought to every role. On the set of Play It, As It Lays in 1972, he met Barry Berenson. She was a talented photographer, an actress, a woman with lineage as interesting as his own, granddaughter of legendary fashion designer Elsa Schiaparelli, sister of model-turned-actress Marisa Berenson. She was younger than him by 17 years, beautiful in a bohemian way, intelligent and warm. Barry was not unaware of Perkins' history. He told her about his sexuality, about his therapy, about his attempt to live as a heterosexual man. According to some accounts, he told her he was changing, that he wanted to become the man she could love. She believed him. Or perhaps she didn't believe him, but loved him anyway. Either way, on August 9, 1973, in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, they married. She was 25. He was 41. The marriage shocked Hollywood. Friends predicted it would collapse within months. Actress Venetia Stevenson later expressed disbelief, saying she'd always perceived Perkins as unmistakably gay. But the marriage held. Barry became his anchor. She was calm where he was intense, relaxed where he was perpetually anxious, grounded where he was haunted. She didn't try to fix him or analyze him. She simply accepted him. In 1974, their first son was born, Osgood, nicknamed Oz. In 1976, their second son arrived, Elvis. Perkins became a father, which paradoxically brought him closer to the appearance of normalcy he'd been chasing. He was still working, still performing, but now he had a family to return home to. He had structured his life around external legitimacy. In 1990, during an interview with The Times, he described married life as having made him much more structured and ordinary, not nearly so grasping and ambitious, not so paranoid, not so fearful. Was it true? It was partly true. The marriage offered genuine stability, but it was built on a foundation of concealment. By the 1970s and 1980s, Perkins continued working steadily. He appeared in Murder on the Orient Express. He starred in The Black Hole. He co-wrote The Last of Sheila with Stephen Sondheim, a mystery film that showcased his intellectual depth. He took character roles, villainous roles, supporting roles, anything that kept him working and kept him away from the romantic leading man parts that Psycho had destroyed him for. He directed theater productions. He directed Psycho III in 1986, reprising his most famous role and earning a Saturn Award nomination. He seemed to have built a life that worked, a performance that held. Nobody in the industry knew his secret. Hollywood had accepted the narrative. Anthony Perkins was a strange, private man who'd married and found peace. That was the story. Then, on a routine visit to a doctor for treatment for a facial palsy, he gave a blood sample. That sample would never remain private. The National Enquirer, through sources still unclear, obtained it and had it tested. In 1990, the tabloid published a bombshell. Psycho star has AIDS virus. Anthony Perkins discovered he was HIV positive, not through a doctor, not through his own revelation, but through a tabloid headline. The shock was compounded by the revelation's source. His privacy, his most fiercely guarded possession, had been violated by a criminal act. The National Enquirer had obtained his blood sample illegally, tested it without consent, and broadcasted his status to millions of readers. But here's what many don't realize. Anthony Perkins had likely contracted HIV around 1986 during the filming of Psycho 3. That means he'd been living with the virus for approximately 4 years before learning about it from a tabloid. He'd been living, working, performing, fathering his children, maintaining his marriage, all while an infection ravaged his immune system. When he finally received confirmation, he made an immediate, conscious decision. He would not go public. He would not tell anyone except Barry. He would keep working as long as he could. He was 60 years old. He'd spent his entire life performing, hiding, constructing elaborate facades to survive in an industry that demanded conformity. He wasn't about to let illness become another public property. For 2 years, Perkins continued working. He appeared in television productions. He directed films. He attended events. Only Barry knew. Only his wife sat with him as his health declined, caring for him with tenderness, managing doctors and medications, carrying the impossible weight of his secret. His 2 sons didn't know. His closest friends didn't know. The industry didn't know. He was performing one final role, the role of a healthy man. He was also, in those 2 years, learning something unexpected. In his final statement, prepared just before his death in September 1992, Perkins wrote, "I have learned more about love, selflessness, and human understanding from the people I have met in this great adventure in the world of AIDS than I ever did in the cutthroat, competitive world in which I spent my life." Those who knew him reported a transformation. His obsessive perfectionism softened. His anxiety quieted. He became gentler, more present, more alive than he'd been in decades, as if approaching death had finally given him permission to stop performing. September 12, 1992. Anthony Perkins died at home in Hollywood, surrounded by Barry, his 2 sons, and close friends who'd gathered during the final days. He was 60 years old. The official statement was careful, controlled. He died of AIDS-related complications. 3 days later, Barry gave an interview to the New York Times. She spoke about the 2 years of silence, about his fear that if anyone knew, he'd never work again, about the way he'd protected everyone around him by carrying the secret alone. She revealed that she and their sons had been tested and were HIV negative. The family had prepared a carefully worded obituary, but it was too late for control. The news spread globally. Anthony Perkins was dead. And the reason, HIV, AIDS, the disease he'd concealed like every other secret, became the headline. The tragedy deepens when you consider what came after. Barry Berenson never remarried. She and her 2 sons struggled with the loss, particularly as AIDS continued its devastation through the 1990s and 2000s. She moved to Jamaica and ran a bar. She built a life as quietly as she could. Then, on September 11, 2001, one day before the 9th anniversary of Anthony's death, Barry was traveling home to Los Angeles after a vacation on Cape Cod. She was a passenger on American Airlines Flight 11. The plane was hijacked by terrorists and deliberately flown into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. She was killed instantly. One family, fractured twice by tragedy, first by the invisible devastation of AIDS in the 1990s, then by the visible, incomprehensible horror of terrorism in 2001. The real tragedy isn't that Anthony Perkins was gay. It's that he was born in an era and industry where that truth couldn't be spoken. The tragedy is that his work, his actual artistic contributions, became secondary to the speculation about his private life. The tragedy is that we live in a world where a man like him felt he had to choose between authenticity and survival, and where survival meant silence. His final years taught him something he'd never learned during decades of fame, that the people who matter most are the ones who love you regardless of performance. That vulnerability is not weakness, that the connections forged through genuine suffering are deeper than any made through ambition. He learned it only when he was dying.